Not only is Castlevania Symphony of the Night a masterpiece of video game design, it's teeming with references to history, religion, literature, and folklore. This is the Annotated Symphony of the Night. Welcome to the Annotated Symphony of the Night. Not so different than a book or a film, important video games are worth studying, which is exactly why this video series exists. In this and in the following videos, I'll be playing through the game while making annotations as to what we find, and the influences that may have placed them there. As for the game itself, though, it was released in 1997 in North America by Konami, and developed in tandem with the 3D Castlevania for the Nintendo 64 as something of a farewell to the classic series, as the sister game was meant to be a franchise reboot. Koji Igarashi, the game's co-director, stated in an interview at GDC in 2014 that his team wasn't the, quote, franchise owners of the series, so they did what they wanted as long as they treated Symphony as a separate game from the 3D Castlevania, implying that it wasn't much of a priority for Konami. I'll sprinkle more development history as this series goes forward. For now, though, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. As you can clearly see, the title screen has a subtle animation that plays after a few seconds, which can easily be missed for a player eager to hit the start button to get into the game itself. The choral arrangement you're hearing is called Prayer, which has overlapping Greek chanting by Symphony's composer, Michiru Yamane's younger sister. It roughly translates into "May your ascension into heaven be blissful." Into the menus, though, it's here that you'll start a new game and edit your save files if desired. Starting a new game prompts us to name the save file, a practice begun in Castlevania III Dracula's Curse for the NES, as players had to maintain a common name for any passwords they would input to skip levels or return to a playthrough. And like that game, it acts as a sort of input system for various secrets as well. In Symphony, having already cleared the game, a player can begin again with codes to alter the game's state. First, the entirety of the castle can be played as Richter Belmont from Rondo of Blood, albeit with some new special moves to help with traversal. Next, they can play the game as the Axe Armor enemy, also from Rondo, which is actually just an item equipped from the status screen. But this is more of a novelty than anything. Finally, a player can begin with the now famous Luck code, which dramatically curbs offense and defense, but spikes Alucard's luck stat to nearly its maximum. Though it has some early game limitations, it's become a staple for more experienced item farmers and speedrunners alike. These icons that flash on the screen that are attached to a save file are worth quickly mentioning too. In the Double Fine Devs Play video, series producer Igarashi mentioned that they had all of their designers make a few, and they all went a little overboard. The team couldn't decide on which one or two that they liked, so they decided to just include all 16 that were finished. For this playthrough, we'll be playing a regular new game. Let's begin. The game opens in a flashback, a narrative device not commonly used in video games even today. The year is significant as it takes place almost 100 years before the publication of Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, which much of the lore series is loosely based, both of which fit neatly within the timeline the franchise producers released shortly after this game. Though it was eventually released on other platforms, notably the Sega Saturn, Symphony was targeted specifically for the Sony PlayStation during its development, and the use of this video sequence is one of the more overt ways it takes advantage of what was then new and more powerful hardware. In the Devs Play video, Igarashi stated that a separate internal team at Konami made this and the 3D castle sequences. They basically delivered it to the Symphony team with more of a, well, here you go sort of attitude, and the team were disappointed with how flat the textures looked. The game is full of great small details, including the ability to manipulate the text of this loading screen. The game's original director, Toru Hagihara, programmed this little trick himself. Symphony is a direct sequel to Dracula X Rondo of Blood, a Castlevania game that, at the time of Symphony's release, had never made it outside of Japan. Hagihara also directed that game. It was released in 1993 for the PC Engine, known in the West as the TurboGrafx 16 CD add-on. As you'll see through the playthrough, many holdovers exist from Rondo of Blood, not the least of which are sprites for a large amount of the enemies in the game, as well as the overall plot. Keep this in mind going forward. What we're seeing is a recreation of the final showdown with series antagonist Dracula from Rondo of Blood. The title card reads Bloodlines, which is a deliberate localization change from the Japanese version, which simply called out the title of Rondo. There's never really been a clear reason for the alteration, though a 2016 episode of classic gaming podcast Retronauts speculated that since the most recent North America Castlevania game was Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis, then the translation team renamed this section for some sort of loose continuity, which doesn't actually exist. It's as good an excuse as any, I suppose. Here we are as Richter Belmont. At the top of the stairs, a hidden room above is also taken directly from Rondo, though the items inside are worthless to Richter. This entire sequence is reused in numerous games in the franchise, dating all the way back to the original Castlevania for the NES.
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
It was not by my hand that I'm once again given flesh. I was called here by humans who wish to pay me tribute.
Tribute? You steal men's souls and make them your slaves.
Perhaps the same could be said of all religions.
Your words are as empty as your soul. Mankind ill needs a savior such as you.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. How about you?
Richter is altered from his appearance in Rondo for a wider moveset. With his screen-clearing item crash ability, which I'm using for the sake of brevity, came from the original game. This fight was actually meant to one-up Rondo. In that game, Richter fights death in the prologue. The designers thought that the only way to outdo that was to have you fight Dracula early on. This battle actually happens in two phases, which, while altered to be a little bit easier, is still a direct recreation of the Rondo final boss fight. Itself something of a duplication of the first Castlevania final boss fight. The battle is unlosable. If Richter takes too much damage, the young Maria Renard will interrupt the battle and cast an invincibility spell, though there are some consequences to letting it get to that point. While this opening crawl plays, it's worth pointing out a couple of important details. The game was partly translated by Jeremy Blaustein, a longtime collaborator with Konami, known for major releases like Snatcher for the Sega CD, and his project after this one, Metal Gear Solid. He and the other localizers injected much of the color into the weapons and enemy names found in the game, though a substantial amount existed in the original Japanese script. The dialogue between Richter and Dracula before the fight began was something of a boilerplate Japanese action game script before translation. Though history is fond of calling out Symphony for its hammy voice acting, the talent that went into the localization of the text is there right from the beginning. The most famous line of the game, "a miserable pile of secrets," was actually found by website Legends of Localization to be a quote from French writer André Malraux. Incidentally, there was originally supposed to be an English language narration over the text that we're seeing. The voice acting was so bad, though, that the North American PR for Konami requested that they just drop it. Igarashi mentions all this in the Devs Play video and notes that, sadly, the original terrible voice acting probably no longer exists. The actual text that we're seeing reiterates the franchise's central lore. Dracula will resurrect once every 100 years, and a lineage of vampire hunters named Belmont will rise to challenge him. We're seeing two games being called out specifically, the aforementioned Rondo of Blood, and closer to the bottom, Castlevania III Dracula's Curse, which Igarashi has mentioned over the years as a game he's very fond of amongst the overall series. Now that the flashback and setup are over, the proper game can begin. Here's our introduction to Alucard and a small cadre of owls whom we'll see as enemies later. Though it's hard to make them out without pausing the game, there's actually small bugs in the foliage here as he runs by. The actual entrance to the castle here has two fascinating pieces of trivia. The first is a bug that lets Richter slide out of the door and outside of the castle. Sadly, there really isn't much to see aside from where we just were, and there's no way to get back in from here, so the player would have to reset the game. This grate at Alucard's feet, though, was meant to be an entrance to what became the underground garden section that was finished for the Sega Saturn version, though without the oversight from Igarashi or the other producers. Chunks of it are still accessible with some game glitching, including a functioning save room. Alucard himself starts equipped with some fairly powerful gear, which, spoilers, won't last long. If you think the status screen looks bland, it's because it was actually just a placeholder that the developers put in. It stayed in the game because they didn't have time to make a new, more visually appealing one. Functionally, it can let you adjust his equipment in various game settings, and also provides valuable info on his current experience level, stats, playtime, and how many rooms he's uncovered in the castle. His starting statistics are based on Richter's performance in the flashback fight. Igarashi mentions in the devs play video that they did this intentionally so that the player would take the opening fight seriously after they figured out it's unlosable. There's a wide range of variables ranging from damage the Richter takes to the weapons he may or may not be using that can affect practically every parameter that Alucard can begin with. There are 1,890 total rooms in the game, each delineated by a blue square in the in-game map. More of the castle can be uncovered by glitching certain areas, which usually appears mapped as white squares. That was a warg, which is not only the first enemy we killed, but also the first of many references to J.R.R. Tolkien's various works. In fact, this monster is a Tolkien double whammy. His name in the Japanese version is Anfauglier, which is the name of, quote, the greatest wolf that ever lived in the Silmarillion. Wargs are less grandiose, though, and while somewhat intelligent, were often used as mounts for orcs and other stories. Tolkien actually took the warg from Norse mythology, though, as the mythological Fenrir and its offspring were wargs. One last thing about the warg is that it's one of 3 enemies in the game that are missable as far as the in-game bestiary is concerned. By not killing any wargs in this opening segment, you'll miss them completely. Alucard put the warg down using Alucard's sword, which is of note not because it shares his name, but is one of the piles of weapons in Symphony that has special attacks that are unique to it, like this teleport strike. Triggering these is either the classic Hadoken or Sonic Boom motions from various fighting games like the Street Fighter series, and don't come assigned to every weapon. I'll point them out in the side window as the game goes on. Often these cost a small amount of magic, which is the blue meter at the top of the screen. Finally moving into the castle, this is a vague recreation of the first stage of the first Castlevania game, something that has become sort of a recurring motif of the series. This room here is a combination of the first large obstacle in the original game and the small underground waterway beneath it, complete with that scrumptious wall meat that we just found. This room also hides probably the most obscurely hidden chamber in the game, but we'll come back to that later on. Now, you won't frequently find me grinding for levels, but it's worth going through the motions to talk about experience a little bit. As GameFAQs users Y2Orty and Z-Keen have found, hit points and maximum heart stocks gained at each successive level are set amounts, but all other stat boosts are randomized, ranging from +1 to 1 stat to +1 to all 4 of them. In practice, that means that with a lot of forethought, careful gear farming, and a certain monastic devotion, a player could effectively build Alucard to be melee focused based on strength, or more of a sorcerer based on his intelligence, though this isn't at all necessary to overwhelm the game. Leveling also comes with diminished returns. As Alucard kills enemies with similar levels, the amount of experience points rewarded will drop as he scales further away from them. Any enemy you kill above your level will have its experience multiplied by 1.25, times how many levels they're away from you up to 5, which is great. However, if you're above their level, you'll get the amount of experience divided by 1.5 per experience value. So if we're getting 9,999 experience for a certain level, the next level after that will be 6,666, and then 4,444, and so on down to 1 experience point. The math is courtesy of GameFAQs user Brian Kern. The mermen are enemies from the first Castlevania game and have 2 entries into Symphony's bestiary. They're a reference to the 1954 Universal horror film The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which is given a shout-out in one of the bestiary logs. Here's another classic hidden item in the ancestral home of the first boss of the whole franchise.
Alucard, what is your business here?
I've come to put an end to this.
Still befriending mortals. I'll not ask you to return to our side, but I demand you cease your attack.
I will not.
You shall regret those words. We will meet again.
Lots to say about this encounter with death and its location. First, Igarashi has a funny anecdote about the death conversation, in that Alucard was originally supposed to say, "No," or "my stuff," when his gear was taken away, but he said it sounded lame. They just had a "what?" lying around, so they used that instead. Let's take a second to notice this background. The character of Stoker's Dracula novel is based very loosely on Wallachian warlord Vlad III, or Vlad Dracula. As was patronymic custom, he was named after his father Vlad II Dracul, whom was part of the chivalric Order of the Dragon, which Dracula derives its etymology. He's posthumously known, though, as Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, because he would impale his enemies and leave their corpses posted around his castle grounds. This location in the game makes for something of an unsubtle historical reference. Getting back to the encounter with death, though, use of the luck code can save Alucard from losing his powerful starting equipment. Unequipping all of his items other than the Lapis Lazuli, an item that is freely given to the player doing a luck code run, will plummet his constitution stat enough that by intentionally hitting this final warg at the correct trajectory, blasts Alucard through the next several screens, skipping death and hoarding that precious equipment. This is a glitch though, and will cut out the music until the game is saved, something that's only really around the corner. Though only naked for a brief period, Alucard can obtain weapons and items found strewn about the castle or as rare drops from certain enemies. These two specific Bone Scimitar enemies will always drop the short sword and the red rust, though. The red Bone Scimitar is actually unique, and he's the only red-tinged one found in the game. The red rust is also unique in its way because it can sometimes misfire. Here's our first save room. Listen to the heart beating in the background. This represents Alucard's own health, and can be loudly heard when he's closer to full hit points or only faintly if he's nearer to death. The coffin spinning is one of those subtle PlayStation touches in that it's polygonal. Our first relic is also located here, and it's the Cube of Zoe. Called the Materialization Cube in the Japanese version, translator Jeremy Blaustein took the opportunity to name it after his daughter, which he recounted in an interview on Hardcore Gaming 101. It causes heart, money, and items to drop from the candles in the game, a Castlevania mainstay. Really quick, I'll usually mention anything interesting that drops from enemies, except the various food items that restore hit points, unless they're really important. This section, at least for now, doesn't have that much to note other than Monster Vial 1, which is dropped by the Merman, and Monster Vial 2, which is dropped by bats. Imagine these as one-time consumable summon spells. Lastly for this video, this is the first of the various loading rooms. The PlayStation hardware was notorious for its difficulty with two-dimensional games. The design team found a subtle way to circumvent the loading times, though, with these rooms, which would partially load both the previous castle location and the next one. We'll definitely be seeing them again. With that, welcome to the Alchemy Laboratory, and we'll continue in Episode 2.